As the nights draw in and we approach Halloween, for many of us there's nothing we like more than getting cozy and settling down with an absolutely terrifying, blood-curdling horror game. But have you ever wondered why? Why do so many of us enjoy the feeling of fear? Well, a team of researchers in Denmark have been asking that very question and even think that a bit of recreational fear might be good for you.
Previous research on the psychology of horror has focused on negative effects, but we have some studies that seem to suggest that there may be positive effects and that those benefits might actually outweigh the negative.
This is Mathias Clayson. He's an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark and, as you might be able to guess from his backdrop, he's a big horror fan.
My professional interest in horror really grows out of personal fascination. I have these vivid memories of myself as a teenager reading a Stephen King novel and being so freaked out, and yet I kept doing it night after night. I was enjoying it and I was terrified, but I also sort of stepped outside of my own mind and asked myself, what's going on here? There are many misunderstandings about the psychology of horror and the nature of horror fans. I wanted to know more. That eventually led me to do research on the phenomenon.
Matthias's interests and research led him to create the Recreational Fear Lab, which aims to find out why people enjoy activities that give them feelings of fear. While that includes a lot of things you might expect, like horror games and movies, it also includes things like extreme sports and even children playing hide and seek. Unsurprisingly, at the Recreational Fear Lab, October can be a busy month.
Every year in October, we do haunted house studies where we put together a research team and we travel to a haunted house and we measure the behavior and the physiology of guests in a commercial haunted attraction. There is nothing like conducting empirical research against the backdrop of delighted screams and chainsaws and the groans of zombies.
According to Matthias's research, when we engage in recreational fear by walking through a haunted house or playing a horror game, we're buying into a kind of make-believe world full of cues that activate biological responses evolved over millions of years. That's why when you're playing a horror game, your palms get sweaty, your heart beats faster, and jump scares make you leap from your chair. You're putting your body into a state of fight or flight, and it's reacting as though those cues are coming from real dangers. But, and this is the key part, because we know it's not real, we can instead enjoy the rush of sensations we get from activating those biological responses and practice our coping strategies for scary situations as a kind of play. What Matthias and his team have found through their research is that there is a kind of inverted U-shaped relationship between enjoyment and fear levels. If the fear level is too low, it'll be boring, but if it's too scary, it's not enjoyable either. This means that there's a sweet spot for every individual, the just right amount of fear in order for them to have a good time. This relationship is a lot like the one we see with the feeling of flow. Check out our previous episode of the show all about that. And much like flow, video games offer the player a great opportunity to balance their levels of fear and enjoyment.
I can't influence the way the story unfolds when I'm watching a horror movie or reading a book, but when I'm playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent, I can decide not to go into the room from which a weird noise comes. And so that feeling of agency, that feeling of being able to influence what happens leads to a higher degree of presence, of investment. And because it's pretend, because there is no real risk, no real danger, we can reap the benefits. We can get all the pleasure out of playing with danger.
Fun is certainly, well, fun. But Matthias's research has shown early indications that engaging with horror media could actually have beneficial effects that stretch beyond simply having a good time while you're scaring yourself silly.
Most previous research on the psychology of horror has focused on negative effects. Media psychologists spent a lot of time, especially back in the 80s, looking into how kids would get nightmares from watching Poltergeist or Gremlins or Jaws. But we have some studies that seem to suggest that there may be positive effects and that those benefits might actually outweigh the negative.
One study in particular by Matthias and his team examined the mental health impact of the COVID-19 lockdowns in March and April of 2020. Their hypothesis was that during this time where everyone was in a state of anxiety and dread, horror fans might be coping better, having exercised those coping strategies for scary situations through engaging with horror media.
So we found actually that horror movie fans had better resilience. They reported fewer stress symptoms, fewer troubles sleeping, fewer concentration issues than non-fans, probably because they have had more exposure to fear stimuli in a kind of playful setting. And they were able to take that practice, that expertise, if you will, and apply it in a real-world context. So that's one example of a positive effect of recreational fear.
This idea of taking stress management techniques learned in a recreational setting and applying them to real-world stress opens up the potential for horror games to be used as a kind of treatment tool, a controlled virtual version of exposure therapy. Thanks to their immersive potential, the use of video games and VR games for this purpose has prompted an exciting new branch of psychological research, looking at the ways video games can be used to help people practice their fear and anxiety responses in a more controlled way. One such study is by Lucy Daniel Watanabe, a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, who is working with games developer Ninja Theory as part of their Insight project, researching how to use game technology to reduce anxiety symptoms.
One thing that we've been looking at is using virtual reality to simulate some experiences that people might find anxiety-inducing. We try and teach them a breathing technique in a boat experience. And you're trying to breathe very slowly and regularly to reduce your heart rate. And then we put them in a stressful situation, which is the dungeon. And in the dungeon, there's a monster crawling around, and they are told that their best way to avoid being detected by the monster is to keep their heart rate low by practicing the breathing technique that they just learned in the boat. You can tell someone to do a breathing technique, but you don't really have any way of making them do it next time they are naturally stressed. What we're trying to do with virtual reality is both teach people these techniques and then immediately have them apply it to something that is stressful. And the hope is that by doing that, they can then take that back into the real world and apply that to the stressful situations there.
This dungeon in Lucy's simulation might seem outlandish, but in this instance having stereotypical horror imagery to draw on was useful. Previous tests playing on more mundane phobias like spiders, public speaking or heights prompted very varied results depending on the individual's tastes. Though it's somewhat of a generic horror scenario, it seems that a monster looming over you is more of a universal fear and more likely to induce the response they're looking for. Plus, it gives Ninja Theory a bit more license to stretch their creative muscles.
What I hope is that we can use gaming technology more in psychiatric research, because I think it is a really interesting avenue for a lot of the things we try and accomplish in psychiatry and psychology, which is eliciting specific emotions and responses from people. Specifically for my research, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to create something that can be used to teach people to control their physiological responses in stressful situations. So teaching people how to, when your heart is racing, calm it down.
So does this mean everyone should be playing horror games as a way to sort of inoculate yourself against world events? Well, probably not. As we said earlier, everyone's individual fear tolerance will be different, so maybe your fear tolerance is Animal Crossing. You do you. That said, Matthias is optimistic about the potential uses of horror video games in future research, as they provide a virtual, repeatable, safe way to prompt fear responses in study participants. There's even the possibility of a mutually beneficial relationship where psychologists benefit from using horror games in studies and game developers benefit from the findings the researchers uncover in order to create more individualized horror experiences.
There may be a future in which game designers and scientists could work more closely together to maybe harness some of the benefits of recreational fear. Maybe design games that are really good at letting players find that sweet spot of fear and so develop that coping potential. Maybe the future will bring horror video games where your current fear level can be measured by heart rate, and the video game detects your fear level and it sees, okay, this guy playing Amnesia is too afraid, I need to turn up the light inside the game. Or, in reverse, he's beginning to be bored, let's turn up the fear jets. That would be a very useful way of applying that finding, I think.
Maybe we can look forward to a future where horror games are not only designed to push your personal fear tolerance, but maximise the potential psychological benefits of playing them too. We may be some way off a doctor prescribing the latest horror blockbuster as a mental health treatment, but if you enjoy them, a scare or two might be good for you. But what about the developers of horror games? What techniques do they use to scare players, and what do they themselves find scary? Over the next few weeks on MindGames, we'll be speaking to a number of horror developers to find out how some of the biggest horror games hope to get inside our heads and stay there long after we stop playing. Until next time, sleep tight.